Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less academic and a lot more herbal. A trip through the foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication. Yes, they did it. But trust me, things got weird and sometimes surprisingly creative. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as a grim mud-covered parade of monks, plagues, and potatoes. But under all that wool and despair, there were people, regular, flawed, experimental people, who occasionally looked at a strange root and thought, well, let's see what happens if I drink this with hot wine. And ointments that convinced people they were flying naked through moonlight, often with Satan's catering staff. Getting high wasn't just for fun. Often it was medicinal, spiritual, or just a desperate decision taken during a particularly long winter. Take henbane, for example, nature's unsettling version of Russian roulette. Carefully prepared, it brought pain relief and sleep. Carelessly used, it led to convulsions and spontaneous forest sprints. Or consider mandrake, the famously human-shaped root said to scream when unearthed. A scream so deadly that harvesters tied it to dogs and stood back. A staple in the unregulated pharmacy of the day, it lived in monastery herbals and peasant gardens alike. Still, healers, mystics, and the incurably curious kept it in circulation. Its human-like form sparked whispers and fears. Its botanical name Mandragora officinarum, barely disguising its folklore. Said to bring sleep, hallucinations, fertility, and confusion, it became a root of choice for those seeking deeper truths, or deeper trouble. To harvest, it was to risk death by scream. Medieval guides warned that the mandrake's cry could kill. Hence the dogs. After harvesting, the mandrake could be dried, powdered, or worn in tiny pouches to ward off evil. It was both medicine and talisman, desired and feared. The church, predictably, wasn't a fan. Anything that induced visions without a bishop present raised eyebrows. Yet monks wrote about it, sometimes with oddly precise instructions. Used well, mandrake dulled surgical pain and offered prophetic dreams. Used poorly, it led to vomiting, blackouts, or the belief that your dinner was plotting against you. At one point, it was even added to beer, until hops, tamer by comparison, replaced it. For something considered part of creation, henbane certainly tested the limits of what was considered holy. Monks recorded its properties, witches swore by it, and peasants simply hoped not to eat it by mistake. In small amounts, it eased toothaches, helped with insomnia, and made childbirth a little less horrifying. Or drip poison into your eyes for beauty. Belladonna, also known as Atropa belladonna, or deadly nightshade, was both enchanting and fatal, the botanical equivalent of a dangerously charming ex. Its name, meaning beautiful lady, came from its cosmetic use. A few drops widened the pupils, giving a mysterious, saintly glow. But the side effects included blurry vision, light sensitivity, and occasional unintended visits to the spirit world. In large doses, it turned one's brain into a hall of mirrors. Visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, wild thirst, and the occasional interpretive dance were all side effects. Henbane might be smoked, brewed, or rubbed into the skin, perfect for anyone who didn't want their perception to behave. This root could lull a person into prophetic dreams, or end their need for dreams altogether. And depending on your place in the social order, it might be administered by a barber, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who swore he learned it from a very wise squirrel. Its extract, dropped into the eyes, made pupils widen, a medieval beauty trend. But it came with blurred vision, heightened light sensitivity, and occasional visions of things that weren't quite there. Used properly, it soothed pain and induced vivid hallucinations. Used recklessly, it flirted with death. And to be fair, who could blame them? Some were offered in sacred rituals, others in whispered folk remedies. And sometimes they were used accidentally, stirred into stews, or rubbed into wounds by apothecaries with the best of intentions and the worst of measurements. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a willingness to accept that nature, generous though she was, often had sharp edges. Europe was overflowing with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could cure your fever, or make you fall in love with your fireplace. The line between medicine and mystical experience was a blurred watercolor, artistically interpreted by physicians, monks, midwives, and herbalists, each with their own level of training and, let's say, imaginative enthusiasm. There was no electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants, and the local entertainment was either watching a knight try to read or wondering how long your neighbor could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that made you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably chew it too. Contrary to modern assumptions, the concept of using substances to expand the mind, escape pain, or simply make one, as they, slightly less horrible, wasn't too rare. It was quietly woven into the fabric of medieval life. It wasn't called getting high, though. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind haystacks. Instead, these experiences were described as visionary states, divine inspiration or pain relief, and in more extreme cases, the kind of mistake one made on an empty stomach. Doctors used herbs, monks grew them. Witches, depending on who you asked, applied them with intention. And nearly everyone encountered these substances in some form, through medicine, ritual, or accidental moldy bread. The catalog of intoxicants extended far beyond warm ale. They had roots that whispered secrets, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that delivered dreams. In medieval times, you didn't need a black market dealer to find mind-altering remedies. For those hoping to dull pain, find peace, or catch a glimpse of the divine in their soup, there were options. Belladonna, meaning beautiful lady, was another favorite. These herbs were brewed into teas, stirred into ointments, smoked, or simply applied to the skin. Henbane, known to botanists as Hyoscyamus niger and to others as that stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, was one of the most notorious. Its legality? Technically fine. But the church looked on with deep suspicion. Visions were meant to come from saints, not shrubs. Then there was mandrake, the root that lived in legend and panic. Imagine you're a noble woman preparing for a feast. You might wear your finest linen, braid flowers into your hair. Yet belladonna did more than play with beauty standards. It had genuine medical uses, even if the line between remedy and risk was razor thin. It was used as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a truth serum, though the truth it produced was often along the lines of the ceiling is dripping Latin prayers. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which interfere with the nervous system in unpredictable ways. From mildly trippy musings to the deeply unsettling question of why the wallpaper seems to be vibrating. Physicians used it, sometimes with careful calculation, other times with the exhausted desperation that only a week of plague could inspire. It appears in ancient herbals, in love charms passed between hands at markets, and in dusty corners of monasteries, where monks jotted down warnings and recipes in equal measure. Applied, well, intimately, the ointments delivered an overwhelming sensation of levitation. The user might experience what felt like soaring through the clouds, attending surreal feasts with demonic hosts, or floating over rooftops in quiet contemplation. The results varied. Sometimes a transcendent astral journey. Other times, waking up in a haystack, missing several teeth, and with no memory of how one got there. The human stomach, being notoriously unforgiving, couldn't tolerate the toxins. Instead, application was topical. And by topical, we mean mucous membranes. And yes, exactly where you think. Hence the broomstick, referred to in some records as a staff anointed for transportation. The broomstick was used to apply the ointment to places with high absorption. Their words were soaked in mystery, wonder, and the occasional existential dread wrapped in floral language. Most encounters ended with someone lighting it on fire, misidentifying it, or calling it devil grass and moving on. But in the incense-filled aisles of medieval churches, another kind of subtle psychoactive experience was taking place, and it came from holy smoke. That's the part responsible for emotion, memory, and a sense of well-being. In simpler terms, sitting through a long Gregorian chant while inhaling clouds of incense may have left worshippers in a tranquil, lightly altered state. In those thickly fogged chapels, many of them poorly ventilated stone halls, the incense didn't just rise with prayers. It clung to robes, soaked into lungs, and gently shifted perception. Pair that with fasting, dehydration, or the general monotony of monastic life, and it's no wonder visions were reported. While monks credited the Holy Spirit, it's possible that some divine revelations came from deeply aromatic resin rather than sacred intervention. Not everyone loved it, of course. Islamic rulers frequently tried to outlaw hashish, fearing it led to laziness, moral decay, or excessive laughter during prayer. And an overwhelming fog of incense drifting through the arches, like a blessing in vapor form. Incense wasn't just for ambiance or spiritual cleansing. It had side effects. Specifically, frankincense and myrrh, two revered resinous substances imported from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. Burned in churches and temples, they were meant to purify the space, chase away bad spirits, and overpower the smell of wool and fish stew. But like all historical substance bans, enforcement was inconsistent. The Hashashin, the origin of the word assassin, were even rumored to use hashish before carrying out missions. That part is likely legend, but it shows just how deeply cannabis was entwined with myth, mystery, and fear. Not exactly a bedtime story for children, but highly effective. Within moments, users reported sensations of flight, visions of feasting with infernal hosts, or hovering in the moonlit air like confused, enchanted weather balloons. Beyond the ointments, medieval potions were often drunk, stirred into wine, broth, or strange liquids that carried the lingering scent of old socks and poor decisions. Inquisitors and clergy took detailed notes, though not for scientific inquiry. Enter hashish, a plant-based balm for existential dread, camel traffic, and contemplative silence. Derived from concentrated cannabis resin, hashish was widely used across Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. And unlike Europe's rub this on your armpit and see God approach, Islamic scholars and mystics documented hashish with surprising precision and curiosity. They wrote about its effects, rituals, and risks with a level of detail that suggests extensive, shall we say, field research. They saw these flying dreams as proof of demonic involvement. Ironic, considering the flights were caused by poorly regulated botanicals and not actual broom-fueled lift. While recreational use did occur, hashish was especially associated with Sufism, the mystical wing of Islam. Sufi practitioners sought divine union through meditation, music, and sometimes a small bite of spiritual inspiration. Hashish was said to dissolve the ego, clear the path to insight, and help one understand the vastness of the universe, or at the very least, stare at a carpet pattern for 6 hours while contemplating the cosmos. But medieval justice was never overly concerned with evidence. While Europe was deep in its experiments with mind-altering salves and poetic accusations of witchcraft, a very different kind of intoxicating exploration was taking place further east. Before modern edibles were wrapped in tidy foil and came in comforting fruity flavors, medieval folk had their own versions, minus the candy coating. And then there were the elixirs peddled by traveling quacks. Today it feels quaint, like something from fairy tales or Halloween decorations. But back then, the broomstick came with a history that was awkward, scandalous, and far more chemical than it first appears. The link between witches and broomsticks had less to do with sweeping and more to do with absorption. Historical accounts, particularly those written by inquisitors suspicious of anything fun, describe witches applying thick, trance-inducing ointments made from henbane, belladonna, and datura. These weren't ingredients for tea. They were potent and potentially lethal. These potions promised to cure heartbreak, boils, demonic possession, and plague, though often their most consistent effect was melting the lining off one's boots. Did they work? Perhaps. Or maybe they simply made you forget what was wrong in the first place. The true magic of these medieval edibles was unpredictability. Would you sleep peacefully, commune with angels, or spend the night shouting at the moon and swearing loyalty to a turnip? Only one way to know. Instead, they relied on ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions that often smelled like regret and sometimes sounded like bad ideas whispered by candlelight. Belladonna found its way into all manner of potions, salves, and some rather questionable medical practices that involved far more creativity than caution, especially when said ointment includes ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a suspicious pinch of hemlock stirred counterclockwise beneath the full moon. Welcome to medieval transdermal delivery systems, or as we might call it today, rubbing strange pastes onto your body and hoping something mystical happens. These mixtures were rarely recreational in the modern sense. Many were tied to ritual, folklore, and spiritual exploration. Some knocked the user unconscious. Others sent them into euphoric visions. And a few left them sincerely believing they were turning into a lizard. The most effective ones were often applied topically, a practice that sounds gentle until you realize that preferred absorption points were the mucous membranes. Need to dull a patient's pain before removing a limb? Belladonna. Need to simulate death for religious theater? Or overly suspicious spouses? Belladonna. Or maybe you simply want to dream your way into a meeting with 3 saints, a medieval raccoon, and possibly the devil. In that case, belladonna would do just fine. Yet despite its undeniable toxicity, belladonna held a firm spot in the medieval medicinal cabinet. And let's be honest, the word ointment doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Cue the infamous flying ointments. Thick, trance-inducing concoctions blended with henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and animal fat, usually pig. Apothecaries, the pharmacists of the day, enjoyed mixing poppy extract with spiced wine, a combination potent enough to numb surgical pain or transport a soul into visions it hadn't asked for. Let's talk about the broomstick, that iconic airborne companion of the medieval witch. And here's the catch. These ointments weren't consumed orally. Were these real experiences? No, they were chemically induced hallucinations. But in an era where magic and medicine shared blurred lines, such visions were rarely questioned. In the thriving intellectual hubs of the Islamic Golden Age, something more refined was happening. Hashish was most often eaten, blended into honey, spices, and fragrant herbs, creating the first historical edibles that didn't taste like regret. Sufi poets and philosophers often referenced hashish in their verses, with the same dreamy metaphors modern songwriters reserve for breakups and starless nights. Meanwhile, back in Europe, cannabis was centuries away from being appreciated. When you picture a medieval church, you might imagine flickering candles, heavy stained glass, solemn chanting. But here's the curious part. Modern studies suggest burning frankincense releases compounds like insensyl acetate, which interacts with the brain's limbic system. Everyone loves a good vibe. Apparently, clerics insisted the incense helped lift the soul to heaven. Realistically, it may have just softened the edges of reality, enough to make 5-hour sermons feel a little less like penance. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting on lo-fi beats, lighting a scented candle, and letting your mind drift, except with more Latin, more robes, and considerably less chill. If there was one thing medieval people could count on, besides taxes and the occasional plague, it was alcohol. To modern scientists, it is a prank from nature, a fungus with side effects that read like a curse scroll. Convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and the belief that your fingers were turning into spiders. This fungus was the accidental psychedelic behind what some scholars call the original LSD experience, centuries before Woodstock or flower crowns. And strangely enough, it worked. Did people understand the reason? Not really. To most medieval bakers, bread was either fine or deeply possessed. Ancient and medieval sources tell tales of invading armies being lured into villages where honey pots had been left behind. Think of them as unlicensed pharmacists with a passion for bark and the moon. When the village physician suggested leeches or bloodletting, these were the ones you visited instead. They had no degrees, but they had knowledge passed through generations. For some, especially herbalists and healers, mind-altering substances were simply part of the medical toolkit. If a root eased childbirth by just one painful breath, it was welcomed. If an herb calmed a mind trembling with grief, it was blessed. Sometimes the patient would whisper songs backward or swear the cat was speaking in French. But if the swelling went down, success. Learned beside smoky hearths and in forest clearings, whispered from mothers to daughters, and sometimes from squirrels to wanderers. For them, altered states were not red flags, but revelations. What looked like plunder turned into convulsions on the forest floor. The locals knew better. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo noted the effects centuries earlier, and the knowledge endured into medieval times. A little honey on bread could ease a headache. A little in wine could inspire visions. Too much, and you'd be introducing yourself to your own foot. It was traded carefully in small ceramic jars. No labels, no warnings, just faith and hope. No one was testing for alkaloids when they were more concerned about whether their neighbor was secretly a werewolf. Some historians even speculate that ergot poisoning played a role in the Salem witch trials. Symptoms like paranoia, hallucinations, and fits aligned suspiciously well. They were the keepers of salves and secrets. Often women midwives, healers, wise ones, they were vital to their communities and deeply feared by the powers that be. Not because they brewed curses, but because they knew things. Their remedies included henbane, mandrake, belladonna, poppy extract blended with honey, fat, wine, and spit. They de-chant protective phrases and send you home with a mixture that could either heal your headache or make you confess to crimes you never committed. It's debated, but one thing isn't. Medieval Europe got high on toast, and most had no idea. The church watched them nervously. Local magistrates eyed them with suspicion. Yet when fever struck, when bones ached, when someone needed to speak with the dead about a missing dowry, these were the people called. They weren't doctors. They weren't priests. They were the original underground wellness influencers. No hashtags, just herbs and results. So after all the salves, brews, roots, incense, bees, and regrettable bread, one question still lingers softly. How did medieval people really feel about getting high? People in colder, damp regions of Europe, especially in parts of France and the Germanic territories, often baked bread from contaminated rye. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider if it fermented. Someone brewed it in a wooden barrel behind their cottage and confidently called it medicine. Whole communities unknowingly consumed ergot-laced loaves, and the results were chaotic. There were two known forms of ergotism. Convulsive ergotism brought spasms, fits, and episodes of uncontrollable laughter or dread. In the mountainous Black Sea region of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, bees harvested nectar from rhododendron flowers. These blooms, lovely and pink, contained grayonotoxin's natural compounds, that tinker with the nervous system in surprising ways. The result? Mad honey, a rare and potent substance that could cause dizziness, hallucinations, nausea, slow heart rate, and deeply introspective visions. Consumed in small doses, it offered a mellow buzz. In larger amounts, it was like falling into a surreal opera starring your own eyebrows. Gangrenous ergotism was far more grim, cutting off circulation, blackening limbs, and sometimes causing them to fall off. Not ideal when all you wanted was toast. Outbreaks led to strange, sometimes terrifying behaviors, like dancing plagues, where groups would dance for days, sometimes until death. Explanations ranged from demons to divine wrath, but the real culprit might have been nothing more than moldy bread. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Water wasn't exactly reliable. Natural springs were often downstream from livestock, waste, or the general detritus of medieval life. Sipping from a stream could mean a quick trip to the outhouse, if you were lucky. So instead, people turned to something they could trust a little more: lightly fermented beverages. Small beer was a daily staple, a low-alcohol drink consumed by everyone from blacksmiths to toddlers. It was brewed not for intoxication, but hydration and survival. Usually crafted by someone named Edith, who measured ingredients with a glance and a prayer. It had the gentle fizz of safety and the faint tang of barley. Of course, not all alcohol was so tame. Those with coin or a looser schedule opted for stronger ales, honey meads, or imported wines. Monks brewed beer with sacred purpose, documenting fermentation techniques with near-religious devotion and, of course, extensive taste testing. In monasteries, brewing was more than duty. It was a vocation. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were ahead of their time. Alcohol wasn't merely a drink. It was a daily companion, a balm for sorrow, celebration, or simply surviving another day with 6 people and a judgmental chicken crammed into one smoky hut. A mug of warm ale could dull the agony of medieval dentistry. A spiced wine could ease melancholy. Mead could momentarily make you forget the rats in the pantry. Taverns and inns weren't just for weary travelers. They were communal therapy offices with more shouting and less confidentiality. People drank to celebrate, to mourn, to gossip, and sometimes to invent interpretive dances that no one asked for. And sometimes, getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a personal choice at all. It was just what happened when you had toast for breakfast. Enter ergot, a parasitic fungus that grew quietly on rye and other cereal grains, unnoticed and uninvited. To the medieval eye, ergot looked like an oddly dark, shriveled kernel. Why? Because hunger was a louder voice than caution, and bread was survival. Hospitals run by the Order of St. Anthony, known for treating victims of ergotism, often prescribed a radical new treatment: wheat bread. Then there's mad honey. Not metaphorically mad, truly wild stuff. Mad honey wasn't just a folk remedy, it was a secret weapon. Not everyone in the medieval world was a priest, noble, or plague-stricken peasant. Some people operated in the quiet margins: shamans, cunning folk, herbalists. They understood which roots stirred visions, which flowers soothed pain, and which mushrooms to avoid unless you wanted to see your ancestors play chess in the sky. If something went wrong, a hallucination involving flying goats or marrying a tree, the blame shifted quickly. Not to poor dosage, but to witchcraft. The answer? Conflicted. Deeply, hilariously, beautifully conflicted. Then there were the spiritual users, monks, mystics, seekers of divine communication. Visions were signs of sanctity, not symptoms. If you stared into the void, and the void whispered back in Latin, you weren't mad, you were enlightened. It was considered a mark of divine favor, perhaps even a step towards sainthood, or, at the very least, earning your own chapel mural. But as always in the Middle Ages, context was everything. Getting high by accident? Understandable. Getting high to speak with angels or saints? Maybe even encouraged. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon while dancing naked in a barley field? It carried not only grain and gold, but whispers, warnings, and ambitions. Without ships, cities could be cut off, slowly starved by siege or silence. With fleets, those same cities could project power, escort riches, blockade rivals, or land troops on distant shores. The Mediterranean, called the Middle Sea, for good reason, was not just geography, it was destiny. Funded by public naval funds like the Theorica, they represented a kind of maritime democracy. Even the poorest citizens had a role, often as oarsmen. But trireme warfare wasn't about holding ground. It was about movement, about turning the sea into a battlefield of momentum and foresight. Soldiers leapt onto enemy decks, turning naval combat into chaotic melees of blade and shield. Romans, not as nimble on the sea, eventually leaned into boarding tactics. They invented devices like the corvus, a spiked boarding bridge that latched onto enemy ships and turned sea battles into brutal street fights. What the Romans lacked in naval grace, they made up for in grit and numbers. Maneuvers like the Deicplus and Periplus allowed fleets to slice through enemy lines, pivot, and strike from unexpected directions. Fire ships loaded with pitch, tar, oil, and sulfur became floating bombs. Lit and released into enemy lines, they were chaos incarnate. Attackers had to be bold or desperate, because once the fire started, no one truly controlled what came next. Flames leapt from deck to deck, smoke choked the air, and the sea mirrored the sky with its burning reflections. It wasn't precision, it was destruction made manifest, a final gamble when all other maneuvers had failed. It was war as choreography, lethal and elegant. It was the common man who rode to glory at Salamis. In battle, triremes weren't floating fortresses, they were dancers. Speed, timing, and maneuverability mattered more than armor. A successful ram required not only velocity, but the perfect angle. Miss, and you might embed your ship in theirs or worse, tip over and join the sea. From the Phoenician trade networks to Roman grain convoys, the currents and coasts of this inland ocean shaped the lives of millions. Fortune floated on these waters, and so did fire, ambition, and ruin. It linked islands to cities, kings to their conquests, and distant ports to the pulse of civilization. Whoever ruled the sea didn't merely own the waves, they controlled the tempo of trade, war, and culture. Naval power wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. While land warfare dealt with terrain, elevation, and fortresses, the ocean was a shifting, borderless chessboard where strategy had to keep pace with the wind. That's where the church began drawing lines thick, ominous lines written in ink, suspicion, and an eventual inquisition. Intent mattered. Substances associated with visions or altered states were treated with wary reverence or outright fear, depending on who was using them. Athens, with its visionary statesman Themistocles, built a navy of triremes, and with it, a sea-based empire and thalassocracy. Narrow, swift, and low to the water, the trireme was built to slice, ram, and vanish again before enemies could react. Powered by 3 tiers of rowers, each trained to move in perfect rhythm, it moved like a blade over silk. Its prow, tipped with bronze and reinforced by oak, could smash into enemy hulls with surgical efficiency. Its low draft allowed for coastal maneuvering and sudden beach landings. It was the apex predator of ancient seas. Its ships secured lifelines to Egypt, extracted tribute from allies, and held Persian ambitions in check. Carthage, born of commerce, evolved into a maritime titan with state-of-the-art dockyards that turned shipbuilding into an art and a science. Generations of sailors grew up knowing the sea better than the soil. And Egypt, commanding the mouth of the Nile and the Red Sea, guarded its trade routes with vessels designed to fight both pirates and time. Monks meditating with incense were deemed holy. Women sipping henbane tea in a cottage were deemed suspicious. Your neighbor's sleeping potion might also be a psychedelic nightcap, a bit of poppy wine for pain relief, a hashish blend for calming nerves, or a henbane infusion to tolerate your brother-in-law's visit. It wasn't rebellion. It was routine. These were remedies passed down alongside recipes for stew and salves for splinters. They weren't magical or profane. They were just part of life. People lived close to the land, and in doing so, they lived close to the herbs and roots that shaped their daily states of mind. The church was quick to brand mind-altering practices as heresy if they weren't tightly wrapped in theology or Latin prayers. In the medieval mind, altered states hovered in that peculiar gray space between miracle and misdemeanor, healing and heresy. They were part of the broader mystery of existence, tangled up with plagues, visions, saints, and dreams of prophetic turn-ups. In a world where divine and demonic could dance on the same village green, and where the sky could open up with either angels or hail, a little herbal escape now and then hardly seemed like the worst idea. And so they kept sipping, rubbing, brewing, and believing, because in a time of chaos, a gentle drift into another state of being might be the closest thing to peace. Anything that hinted at loss of control, be it trance, intoxication, or inconvenient honesty, tended to raise clerical eyebrows. Saints could have visions. Peasants were probably just possessed. Meanwhile, in the thatched rooftops and garden paths of everyday villages, attitudes were more relaxed. How these substances were perceived depended greatly on who you were, what you were using, and critically, whether anyone tattled. In the ancient world, the sea wasn't a void to be crossed. It was the living artery of empire. For maritime powers like Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, supremacy on the water was non-negotiable. These empires invested heavily in maritime infrastructure: dry docks, shipyards, fortified harbors, and floating fortresses. In this world, the trireme reigned supreme. It was not just a vessel, it was a weapon of precision. Athenian triremes were especially feared. Above deck, a small squad of marines, perhaps a dozen hoplites and a few archers, stood ready to defend or attack. And when things got messy, when ships locked, oars snapped, and rams missed, boarding began. But nothing was as terrifying as fire. When all else failed, fleets turned to flames. Ideally, the fire ship would drift into tightly packed enemy lines, igniting sails, decks, and anything else unfortunate enough to be flammable. One of the earliest recorded uses of fire ships comes from the Greco-Persian conflicts, where desperate defenders hurled flaming rafts or boats toward enemy galleys. This liquid flame allegedly burned even on water and could not be extinguished with ordinary means. Though Greek fire is more medieval than truly ancient, its roots trace back to these early naval fire tactics. Other ancient fleets, including Egyptian and Phoenician, also employed variations of fire-based weapons, especially against pirates or during sieges. Remains one of the most decisive sea battles of the ancient world. That wind didn't just save Athens, it positioned it as protector and soon ruler of the Aegean. Under the Delian League, Athens began extracting tribute from allied city-states, supposedly for mutual naval defense. In practice, this tribute funded Athens' own ambitions: shipbuilding, public architecture, and the expansion of its maritime dominance. Coastal defenders might catapult flaming pots or arrows onto attacking ships, turning the sea into a dangerous inferno. Their shipyards, especially the vast circular harbor of Carthage, could build and house hundreds of warships. The city's maritime dominance wasn't just about force, it was commerce. Carthaginian merchants navigated the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa, trading tin and silver, and bringing back exotic goods. The navy ensured pirates, rival traders, or Roman ambitions didn't interfere with this lucrative flow. But Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to embrace naval power, both on the Nile and at sea. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptian shipbuilders crafted vessels from bundled papyrus reeds and later from cedarwood imported from Lebanon. Egypt developed seagoing fleets capable of challenging pirates, repelling invasions, and projecting power beyond its borders. Under rulers like Thutmose III and Rameses III, warships took part in campaigns against the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders threatening the eastern Mediterranean. These battles, recorded in vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu, show Egyptian archers firing from ships and marines, engaging in brutal close combat aboard narrow wooden decks. But its long legacy of riverine and coastal warfare laid the foundation for naval traditions across the ancient Near East. Egypt's ships may not have ruled the open sea, but they ruled the waters that connected its world. These riverboats transported grain, gold, soldiers, and even colossal statues. They often featured raised fighting platforms and were crewed by archers, spearmen, and sailors trained in both combat and navigation. Their primary advantage lay in mobility along coasts and rivers, where they could rapidly deploy soldiers or intercept merchant traffic. Pharaohs led naval expeditions southward into Nubia and eastward across the Red Sea to Punt, a mysterious land rich in incense, ivory, and exotic animals. Its ships may not have been as famous as Greek triremes or Carthaginian quinqueremes, but for thousands of years, Egypt relied on watercraft to maintain its empire, transport troops, and protect its economic lifelines. This was no theory. Carthage had an assembly line-style dock system allowing rapid construction and repair, unprecedented in the ancient world. Ports like Byblos and Tanis became hubs of commerce and naval logistics. Foreign rulers sought Egyptian shipbuilders for their craftsmanship. When they captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquereme, they reverse-engineered it, complete with the corvus, a boarding ramp that neutralized Carthage's superior seamanship by turning sea battles into land skirmishes. Despite early defeats, Carthage held its own through brilliant naval commanders and tactical mastery. In the First Punic War, they fought dozens of major sea battles. At Trapani, they executed a flawless maneuver destroying a Roman fleet, despite being outnumbered, proving Carthage still ruled the sea. Their ships, often quadriremes or quinqueremes, were heavier and more powerful than Athenian triremes, designed not only for speed, but for brute force. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage's fleet was gone, its shipyards dismantled, and its power broken. Still, the legend of Carthaginian naval dominance endures. They weren't just warriors on the water. They were master merchants, innovative shipbuilders, and bold navigators who once ruled the seas through wit, wealth, and wood. But it wasn't just about military might. The fleet democratized Athens. The poorest citizens, those who couldn't afford armor or land to fight as hoplites, became essential rowers in the triremes. Their vital contribution gave them political clout, transforming the Athenian assembly and empowering the lower classes. Sea power became people power. In the cramped confines of harbors or narrow straits, where maneuverability was limited, a single fire ship could spark mass panic and shatter even the most disciplined formations. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta, a historically land-based power, built its own fleet with Persian money, and eventually crushed the Athenian navy at Aegospotami in 405 BC. It also proved that ships could be as much political tools as weapons. If Athens ruled the Aegean, Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean. With its fleet gone, Athens was starved into surrender. In what is now Tunisia, Carthage built its power not just on conquest, but on trade, seafaring, and unmatched naval innovation. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage was not only a wealthy city, but the nerve center of a sprawling maritime network stretching from Spain to Sicily and North Africa to Sardinia. Carthaginian power was made possible by its fleet. It panicked crews, devoured wooden hulls, and spread faster than commands could be shouted. Even the most seasoned sailors would abandon ship at the first hint of pitch smoke. Fire was an uncontrollable force that tested the nerves of warriors and sailors alike. But fire at sea was a double-edged sword. Winds could shift unexpectedly. Flames could backfire. When a massive vein of silver was discovered in the mines of Laurium, Themistocles, an ambitious Athenian politician, convinced his fellow citizens not to divide the wealth, but to invest it in building a fleet, lots of them. This bold plan forever altered history. With over 200 warships at its peak, the Athenian navy became the backbone of what we now call the Athenian Empire. The city's power no longer rested solely on hoplite infantry or stone walls. It sailed on wood, sweat, and strategy. And a poorly timed fire ship might burn your own fleet as easily as the enemy's. For that reason, fire was often reserved for moments of desperation. Blockades, surprise attacks, or last stands where the potential havoc outweighed the risk. The pinnacle of ancient incendiary warfare came centuries later with Greek fire, a mysterious and fearsome weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire. The psychological effect of fire at sea was unmatched. A ram could be blocked, a boarding assault repelled, but fire was chaos made manifest. In the 5th century B.C.E., Athens transformed itself from a primarily landlocked city-state into a dominant naval superpower, and it all began with silver. The victory at Salamis in 480 BCE, where the Athenian fleet trapped and annihilated the Persian navy in narrow straits. The navy allowed Athens to enforce loyalty, suppress rebellions, and project power far beyond its borders. However, this dominance came at a price. Athens' over-reliance on its navy and coercive treatment of allies sowed deep resentment. Still, the legacy of Athenian naval power endured. It showed that a city-state with limited land could become an imperial force through mastery of the sea. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 800 BCE, while the Athenians refined the trireme, the Carthaginians took naval engineering to industrial levels. Their naval doctrine leaned toward ramming and boarding, supported by experienced mercenary marines and Libyan Phoenician sailors who had grown up on the sea. Then came the Punic Wars. Rome, rising in the Italian peninsula, recognized that defeating Carthage meant building a navy from scratch. But quantity eventually overwhelmed quality. Roman persistence, better supply lines, and brutal discipline turned the tide. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids, pharaohs, and temples, not fleets. The Nile was Egypt's highway, an artery connecting north and south, desert and delta. Egypt's naval ambitions weren't limited to rivers. By the New Kingdom period, unlike the sleek triremes of Greece, Egyptian seafaring ships were broad, sail-driven vessels with limited maneuverability. Egyptian naval strength also underpinned its economy. Grain exports to the Levant and trade with the Aegean were secured by escort ships. Over time, Egypt's naval power waned under successive waves of foreign rule. Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans. But they ruled the rhythm of empire, sailing where the Nile flowed, where the winds allowed, and where power demanded. When the Roman Republic first rose to prominence, it was not a naval power. Rome's early strength lay in its disciplined legions, its mastery of road building, and its relentless expansion across the Italian peninsula. Shipbuilding, at the time, was not among its strengths. Their solution was the corvus, a boarding bridge with a metal spike that could latch onto enemy vessels. With it, Roman marines could storm enemy decks and turn sea battles into land battles, something far more familiar to the average legionary. Yet that changed dramatically and rapidly when Rome found itself locked in a bitter contest for control of the Mediterranean against Carthage. The Classis Missinensis and Classis Ravenatus became principal imperial fleets tasked with protecting trade, quelling piracy, and transporting legions across distant provinces. It treated the ocean as a strategic extension of its legions, a domain to be mastered when required but not worshipped. Yet by the 1st century CE, the phrase Mare Nostrum, our sea, was more than a boast. It was a reality. Rome had come to dominate the Mediterranean, not through tradition, but through adaptability, innovation, and the sheer will to conquer. The sea, once a vulnerability, had become its moat. Though naval warfare was no longer the centerpiece of Roman conquest, maritime control became the silent scaffolding of empire-linking ports, transporting supplies and maintaining imperial cohesion. Harbors became centers of strategy, coordination, and repair. Navigational techniques improved, and innovations in hull shape, rowing coordination, and ballast laid the groundwork for future naval architecture, later echoed in Byzantine, Islamic, and even Renaissance fleets. What followed was one of the most striking naval transformations in ancient history. Cities with strong fleets, like Rhodes or Alexandria, flourished not just as naval bases, but as thriving cosmopolitan centers. They reshaped not just military doctrines, but the very way conflict at sea was understood. But their naval exploits were just as vital, and often more enduring. Ancient naval warfare wasn't simply about who had the fastest ship or the sharpest. It was about who could see the sea as a stage, not just for war, but for history itself. The sea could be more than a battlefield. It could be a weapon in itself. Control, speed, mobility, these became as important as brute strength. Ports became magnets for scholars, artisans, and revolutionary thinkers. At the start of the First Punic War, in 264 BCE, Rome had almost no fleet to speak of. Control of the sea was more than a military advantage. It was a way of controlling the flow of goods, people, language, and culture. The wake of these fleets left more than ripples in the water. It left ripples across civilization. Carthage, by contrast, had ruled the seas for centuries. But the Romans were nothing if not determined. Athens rose to cultural and economic greatness because of its fleet. Carthage transformed its naval reach into a vast trading empire. And Rome, arriving late to the maritime stage, leveraged naval dominance to unify the Mediterranean world. Land armies could conquer territory, but fleets allowed empires to hold it, to nourish it, and to extend their influence across entire continents. According to legend, they captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquereme and used it as a prototype. Egyptian ships ferried sacred goods, papyrus, gold, incense toward the Levant and beyond. Phoenician traders shared not only goods, but their alphabet and religious beliefs with nearly every port they visited. In battles like Mylae and Cape Ecnomus, Roman fleets manned by relatively inexperienced sailors defeated veteran Carthaginian crews. It was not elegance or seamanship that won the day. It was the brutal efficiency of the corvus and the ferocity of Roman infantry. Though the device was eventually abandoned for making ships dangerously top-heavy, its brief tenure had already shifted the tide of the war. Within months, they had mass-produced a navy, building hundreds of ships through sheer manpower, engineering willpower, and state-level coordination. Rome quickly realized it couldn't outmaneuver Carthage at sea. It didn't have the sailors or the tradition. So it changed the nature of the conflict. The results were swift and startling. By the Second Punic War, Rome's naval infrastructure had matured. Its fleets patrolled the western Mediterranean, secured grain routes, safeguarded communications with Iberia and North Africa, and cut off Hannibal's ability to reinforce from Carthage. Naval blockades and amphibious landings became standard tactics. Under the empire, the role of the navy evolved further. Rome, unlike Athens or Carthage, never built its identity around the sea. Ancient naval warfare didn't merely shape battles. It shaped the very architecture of power. Navies forged empires. The sea was also a cultural thoroughfare. Greek colonists traveled by ship to found cities across southern Italy and Asia Minor, bringing with them art, language, and ideas. Naval power was never purely martial. It was civilizational. Technologically, ancient navies sparked revolutions. The evolution from biremes to triremes, and then to massive polyremes, reflected not just military ambition, but breakthroughs in ship design and maritime logistics. Economically, navies safeguarded prosperity. Protected trade routes enabled the reliable flow of good silks from the east, spices, tin, wine, and glass. And there was a psychological dimension as well. The tactics of fire ships, ramming attacks, and brutal boarding actions left lasting impressions on the imagination. Today, we remember these empires for their land conquests, the roads they built, the walls they raised, the territories they claimed. In the end, the triremes may be gone, but their wake still ripples through time. It was the beginning of a revolt that would shake the ancient world. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus officially rebelled. Persia, once a subordinate kingdom, now declared its independence and its intent to reshape the region. When the final confrontation came, it wasn't the Medes who prevailed, it was Cyrus. Astyages' own army turned against him. The once powerful Median Empire collapsed with shocking speed. Croesus ruled from Sardis, a city gleaming with wealth, luxury, and confident power. His armies were experienced, especially his cavalry, and he sought to prevent Persian expansion before it reached his doorstep. After a hard-fought encounter, Croesus withdrew to Sardis, expecting the campaign to pause for winter. Herodotus tells us that, as Croesus faced execution by fire, he cried out the name of Solon, the Athenian sage who warned against judging a man's fortune before his death. Moved by the wisdom or the omen, Cyrus halted the execution. Whether historical or legendary, the tale reflects a consistent truth about Cyrus. He led not through fear, but with a measured and strategic sense of mercy. It had been home to Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar II, and stories of grandeur. Its temples soared, its ziggurats loomed, and its people were proud. But beneath the stone and ceremony, dissatisfaction brewed. Its ruler Nabonidus. His army defeated Babylonian forces at Opis, a strategic city on the Tigris. According to Babylonian records and Greek sources alike, the gates opened without a fight. Whether through political negotiation or internal betrayal, Cyrus entered the city peacefully. He respected local religious practices, paid homage to Marduk, and presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful protector of Babylon's legacy. But the true genius of the campaign lay in its message. The Persians didn't frame themselves as invaders, they posed as liberators. Etched in Akkadian cuneiform, it declares that Cyrus had been chosen by Marduk to bring order and healing. He restored temples, released captives, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands. Among them were the Jews, exiled decades earlier from Jerusalem. Cyrus allowed them to return and rebuild their temple, a decree so profound that he is referred to in the Hebrew Bible as God's anointed. Their proclamations promised to restore justice, religious integrity, and the favor of the gods. Had alienated the priesthood of Marduk and spent long periods away from the capital, leaving his son Belshazzar in charge. Unrest simmered. He believed Cyrus would regroup and return in spring. But Cyrus had other plans. He pursued relentlessly and laid siege to Sardis in the heart of winter, an audacious move. He even used camels to startle the Lydian cavalry, nullifying their most powerful asset. Croesus sought alliances with Egypt and Babylon, consulted the oracle at Delphi, and prepared for war. The oracle's response was cryptic. If he crossed the river to fight, he would destroy a great empire. Emboldened, Croesus marched. He inherited vast wealth, control of trade routes, and influence over the Greek cities of Ionia along the Aegean coast. Though these cities resisted, they could not withstand his growing momentum. The fall of Croesus marked more than the end of a wealthy kingdom. It signaled the ascendancy of an empire rooted in both force and diplomacy. And for Cyrus, it was merely another step forward. And when Cyrus entered Ecbatana, the Median capital, it wasn't as a destroyer, it was as a ruler of a new kind. He kept local traditions intact, respected Median systems, and welcomed former enemies into his administration. This inclusive style would become a hallmark of his reign. What followed wasn't one climactic battle, but rather a drawn-out and disciplined campaign. Over 3 years, Cyrus and his forces pressed deeper into Median territory, gradually gaining momentum and support. Disaffected nobles, regional allies, and former enemies found themselves drawn to his growing legend. And it wasn't only his military acumen that set him apart, it was his restraint. Cyrus spared the lives of many who surrendered, earning both admiration and fear. As his star rose, the court of King Astyages began to collapse under its own weight. Loyalty fractured, and morale waned. By 550 BC, with Media now under his control, Cyrus had unified the Iranian plateau. But he didn't stop there. This was just the beginning. By defeating the Medes, Cyrus didn't just liberate Persia. He inherited the machinery of a former empire. His territory now stretched from the Zagros Mountains into Central Asia. And as his influence solidified in the east, his gaze turned westward. There lay Lydia, a fabulously wealthy kingdom ruled by King Croesus I of the richest men of the ancient world. But the empire he destroyed turned out to be his own. In 547 BCE, near the Halys River, the armies clashed. Sardis fell within weeks. Croesus was taken alive, and instead of executing him, Cyrus spared him, perhaps even making him an advisor. With Lydia under his control, Cyrus gained more than land. By the late 540s BCE, one major power still remained between Cyrus and dominance of the Near East: Babylon. This ancient city, long a center of Mesopotamian power and myth, stood mighty behind its walls. Cyrus recognized an opportunity. In 539 BCE, he launched his campaign not with brute force, but with precision. When Cyrus finally approached Babylon itself, the city did not resist. His rule was immortalized in the Cyrus Cylinder, often called the first charter of human rights. After entering Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great didn't just take the throne. He rewrote the rules of empire, who oversaw taxation, security, and justice in their regions. These officials were typically selected from local elites, but remained accountable to Cyrus's central authority. This balance of local familiarity and imperial oversight formed the backbone of Achaemenid governance for generations. Beyond administration, Cyrus invested deeply in infrastructure. He improved trade routes, protected caravans, and ensured merchants were treated fairly. He recognized that commerce, not just conquest, was vital to a thriving and stable realm. His empire wasn't merely a military machine. It was an interconnected economic and cultural network stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Cyrus was killed, cut down in combat, far from the cities and courts that had made him legendary. There, he was buried in a simple yet dignified tomb, a structure that still stands in the quiet Persian plain, a lasting monument to a ruler who reshaped the ancient world. With his passing, the throne moved to his son, Cambyses II, who would continue Persia's expansion, most notably into Egypt. But Cyrus's unique blend of tolerance, vision, and leadership would never be fully replicated. Herodotus even claimed that Tamiris decapitated his body and placed his head in a skin filled with blood, saying, "Drink your fill of blood, you who thirsted for it." But these weren't empty boasts. His legitimacy wasn't based on fear, but on fairness. His authority wasn't built on bloodshed alone, but on the belief that good governance was its own kind of greatness. While likely mythologized, the tale underscores a brutal end to a monumental life. The book of Isaiah calls him the Lord's anointed, a title reserved for kings of Israel. Xenophon's Cyropedia depicted him as the ideal ruler, just, wise, courageous, and moderate. Though not a strict biography, The work shaped Greek and Roman ideas about leadership for centuries. It was read not only as history, but as political philosophy. He showed the world that strength and compassion need not be opposites, and that an empire could be held together not by force alone, but by fairness and wisdom. His reign proved that rulers could wield immense power without abandoning humanity. Many of them shaved their heads, but this wasn't a practical decision alone. It was a symbol, a statement, a clean canvas. And upon that canvas, they placed some of the most elaborate wigs the ancient world ever saw. Wigs in ancient Egypt weren't just fashionable. They were essential markers of identity, status, and purity. His decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem marked a defining moment in their history. Few figures in history command such wide admiration, and fewer still deserve it as much. To this day, he is celebrated as a righteous Gentile, a ruler who used power to uplift, not destroy. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia centuries later, he visited Cyrus's tomb and ordered it restored after it had been looted. Zoroastrian priests associated him with divine justice. Even today, many Iranians revere him as the father of the nation. But his influence transcends one culture. He became a figure admired across continents and centuries. The Macedonian conqueror, often compared to Cyrus, seemed to recognize in him a kindred spirit. Cambyses II and later, Darius the Great didn't simply build on his conquests, they solidified his vision. Iran's last Shah invoked his memory to promote unity and progress. Today, the Cyrus cylinder inscribed with his decades of tolerance and respect is displayed at the United Nations, hailed as one of the earliest declarations of human rights. Local leaders were often retained, preserving familiarity and preventing unnecessary unrest. In fact, many early satrapies experienced fewer rebellions than under previous regimes, because Cyrus had built something people didn't want to overthrow. The satrapy system, with its semi-autonomous governors loyal to the central king, enabled effective rule over a diverse and expansive population. Though debated, the association speaks to the enduring respect Cyrus commands across faiths. These governors enforced laws, collected taxes, and kept peace all while respecting local customs. Cyrus also understood this subtle power as symbolism. In every city he claimed, he made deliberate gestures of respect, restoring temples, partaking in local rituals, and preserving sacred institutions. He left behind a political blueprint, a philosophical precedent, and a reputation so revered that even centuries later, his name inspired awe. The Achaemenid Empire he founded became the largest the world had ever seen to that point, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. But it wasn't the scale alone that mattered. It was how the empire functioned. From the shores of the Aegean to the steppes of Central Asia, his empire stretched farther than any before it. But his ambitions reached still farther. ARUND 530 BCE, he turned his attention to the northeast, toward the nomadic Massagetae, fierce confederation of steppe warriors led by the formidable Queen Tamiris. These weren't empty acts. They were brilliant diplomatic strategies that often earned him loyalty where others might have faced resistance. According to Herodotus, Cyrus initially attempted diplomacy by proposing marriage to Tamiris, a gesture she immediately recognized as a political ruse. When that failed, Cyrus set a trap. He left behind a lavish banquet with strong wine, knowing the Massagetae were unaccustomed to alcohol. After a night of celebration, many warriors, including Tamiris's own son, were ambushed and slain. What remains most remarkable is how little opposition he faced after conquest. Rather than inspiring revolt, his leadership often cultivated admiration. Even the Greeks, typically dismissive of foreign rulers, viewed him through an unusually positive lens. Xenophon, the Athenian historian and student of Socrates, later penned the Cyropaedia, a partly fictional but deeply admiring portrayal of Cyrus as the model of enlightened kingship. By the end of his reign, Cyrus the Great had changed the map of the ancient world. These horse-riding tribes were seen by Persians as wild and dangerous, but they were no simple prey. Grief-stricken and furious, Tamiris swore revenge. In the battle that followed, the Massagidae overwhelmed the Persian forces. Cyrus's body was returned to Pasargadae, the capital he founded. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind more than a vast empire. Cyrus's policies of inclusion and administrative innovation were carried forward by his successors. Religious and cultural tolerance remained official policy. Temples across the empire, from Babylon to Thebes, were maintained and protected. He redefined what it meant to be king. He wasn't just ruler of Persia. He bore titles like King of the Four Corners of the World. Even in death, his influence endured. His tomb at Pasargadae, a limestone monument both humble and eternal, became a place of reverence. Later, Persian dynasties invoked Cyrus's name to validate their rule. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus is not depicted as a foreign oppressor, but as a liberator. In Greece, where war with Persia would soon become legendary, Cyrus remained an exception. In Islamic tradition, some have identified Cyrus with Dul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one in the Kur, and who travels the world, building walls to protect people from chaos. In modern times, his legacy still echoes. Thomas Jefferson reportedly kept a copy of the Cyropedia by his bedside, inspired by its model of enlightened governance. Cyrus's story resonates not because of the lands he conquered, but because of how he ruled. More than 2 millennia later, Cyrus the Great remains a paradox, an empire builder celebrated for mercy, a king praised by those he conquered. In the blistering sun of the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians made a bold choice. Men and women of high rank didn't just wear them, they flaunted them. These weren't simple accessories either. Wigs in ancient Egypt could be fashioned from real human hair, imported horsehair, or finely woven plant fibers. A noblewoman's wig might shimmer with floral decorations, colorful bands, or precious metal clasps that signaled her station. A priestess might wear a tightly woven style symmetrical and orderly reflecting the divine order she served. For men, particularly those serving in Pharaoh's court, a thick, stylized wig was more than mere appearance. It was an expression of closeness to divinity and a reaffirmation of their role in the sacred hierarchy. Wealthy elites often commissioned pieces with multiple layers, intricate braiding, golden beads, and even scented cones delicately placed atop them, wax-based perfumes that would slowly melt in the sun, releasing fragrance throughout the day and bathing their wearer in luxury. These weren't just for flair, they served both function and intimidation. Excavations in Scandinavian burial sites have uncovered combs, pins, and grooming tools, hinting at the daily care devoted to maintaining their coiffures. Grooming wasn't vanity, it was virtue. Walking into battle with styled locks and a braided beard was not simply practical, it was a signal of courage and readiness. Because to shame a warrior by stealing his hair was to attack his very honor. The Flavian tower style, a towering arrangement of curls and braids, became an elite status symbol, possible only through hours of labor and the assistance of many hands. Short, practical cuts were a visual reminder of submission and function. Yet even within these confines, subtle acts of expression sometimes endured. The more elaborate the hair, the more clearly a woman signaled her wealth and social importance. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Sham age, the top knot worn by samurai. Born from practicality, it evolved into a symbol of deep personal duty. Government edicts even regulated hair by class, and yet artists, actors, and masterless samurai often bent the rules using hair as a quiet rebellion against rigid hierarchies. From the Sahel to the savannas, hairstyles marked everything from marital status to spiritual initiation. The weight of symbolism, woven with care and pride, stretched across every region. And during the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, hair became a tool of resistance. Cornrows weren't merely practical. They were maps, stories, survival strategies encoded in silence. Let your breath slow, your eyes soften, and your mind grow still. In Nubia, queens wore ornate braids and headpieces that rivaled Egyptian royalty. Among the Yoruba and Igbo, hairdressers held sacred roles, entrusted with more than just appearance, with essence itself. In ancient Japan, every strand was touched by duty, devotion, or defiance. The shaved crown made the helmet fit more comfortably in war, but in peacetime, it marked the samurai's adherence to Bushido, the way of the warrior. It carried the strength of memory and the weight of ancestry. Colonial forces would later try to erase these traditions, but they endured. Each braid, twist, and coil carried identity forward, through time, over oceans, into new generations. And so, as we leave behind the braided halls of Egypt, the windswept plains of the Vikings, the marble forums of Rome, the quiet tea houses of Japan, and the sun-soaked earth of ancient Africa, let us remember that even something as small as a strand of hair carries stories of power and beauty, of devotion and identity, of resistance and care. To cut it was to renounce one's honor, sometimes as a punishment, other times as a final act before ritual death. Every culture, every people, every age, whispering who they were, not through loud voices, but through the quiet language of daily life. Empresses set fashion trends with each coin minted or statue erected, their hairstyles copied across the empire in a gesture of loyalty and admiration. These glistening sheets of black hair were expressions of elegance, patience, and refined status. Later, during the Edo period, elaborate hairstyles like the Shimada bun became popular. Decorated with combs and pins, each detail told a story of age, status, or profession. Norse mythology echoed this reverence. Thor's fiery beard, Loki's shape-shifting tricks, and the goddess Sif's fabled golden locks, so precious that when Loki cut them, he was forced to beg the dwarves to forge magical replacements. Hair wasn't just mortal, it was divine. Long, flowing locks or exotic braids gave them a flair that stirred fear and fascination in equal measure. Some Romans even embraced barbarian styles as a quiet rejection of imperial conformity. In Rome, hair wasn't just about looking good, it was about saying something. For Viking women, hair held equal importance. Long, well-maintained hair was a symbol of femininity and high status. In a society where identity was shaped by class, gender, and allegiance, hair became an essential form of silent communication. For Roman men in the early Republic, the ideal was short, clean, and conservative. Anything longer was seen as foreign, indolent, or suspect. Haircuts weren't just grooming. They were civic declarations of loyalty, discipline, and Roman virtue. Women wove ribbons or beads into complex braids, each twist a reflection of pride and social standing. Emperors like Nero and Commodus embraced longer, curlier locks, sculpted to mimic divine figures or Greek philosophers. Some even wore what we now call the Roman tapnata front-raised curl, meant to signal intellect and refinement. These styles weren't haphazard. They were deliberate visual propaganda. They shaved their entire bodies, including their heads, to maintain ritual cleanliness. Yet even they occasionally wore ceremonial wigs, symbols not of vanity, but of spiritual identity, connecting them to their roles within the sacred order. For women, hairstyles were intricately tied to femininity, fertility, and personal power. Children, too, had their own distinct style. Many bore the sidelock of youth, a shaved head with one ornate braid trailing down, a charming and sacred symbol of innocence and growth. But that truth runs deep. Viking hair was a cultural emblem, a marker of identity, masculinity, clan allegiance, and even seduction. In a world where appearance projected power, long hair wasn't a luxury, it was a statement. This singular braid would be ceremonially cut when the child came of age, or passed through spiritual rites of passage. The priests, in stark contrast to the opulence of court life, followed a path of purification. Mummies were often buried with wigs in place, ensuring their beauty and social rank accompanied them into eternity. In ancient Egypt, hair was far more than vanity. It was an immortal identity. Perhaps most poignant of all, wigs journeyed with their wearers into the afterlife. If you imagine a Viking, the image likely includes wild beards and intricately braided hair, a visual shaped as much by sagas and cinema as by truth. Viking men commonly wore their hair long, styled in braids, top knots, or partially shaved heads. Married women often wrapped or partially covered their hair to indicate their status, an unspoken signal, much like a wedding ring. Hair even held legal weight. In Viking law, cutting off someone's hair without consent was a serious insult, an offense severe enough to spark retribution, even blood feuds. The Romans, too, understood the subtle power of hair. But as the empire matured, so did its style. Roman women's hairstyles, however, reached architectural heights. For enslaved people and soldiers, by contrast, simplicity was imposed. And then there were the rebels. Gladiators, part athlete, part spectacle, adopted dramatic hair to amplify their public persona. In Japan, hair was bound both literally and spiritually to tradition. Japanese women's hair also carried weighty meaning. In the Heian period, noble women grew their hair in long, flowing styles known as suburakashi, often longer than their bodies. Courtesans and geisha crafted their hair into visual symphonies, beautiful yet encoded. Styles indicated experience, training level, and availability. And across ancient Africa, hair was language and intricate dialect of strands, coils, and patterns. In Namibia, the Hema women shaped their hair with red ochre and butterfat, sculpting braids that reflected age, fertility, and life transitions. Even in mourning or spiritual transformation, African hair spoke. These tales, told in silence through the shape of a lock, the weight of a braid, or the stillness of a ceremonial style, linger across centuries like the soft rustle of dreams. And now, as the stories settle like dust on parchment, allow your thoughts to drift gently like silk in a breeze. You are safe. You are at rest. The past has spoken, and now the night takes its turn. Sleep well, traveler. Sleep deeply, and let history keep watch.